Thanks again for making the Locked On Ole Miss podcast your first listen every day. We're free and available wherever you get your podcast, including YouTube. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every single day. Also, thank you for making the Locked On Ole Miss podcast your Ole Miss morning show. That means a lot to me. Thanks a bunch for that. We have Brad Logan from Inside the Rebels, the Red and Blue Crew podcast. If you haven't listened to that, you need to subscribe to that. It's available, I guess, on Spotify and is matriculating around all the podcast apps, right, bro?
Yeah, the company we use disperses it amongst all your normal audio podcast platforms. So it's done very, very well the last couple of shows.
Yeah, pretty good stuff. Just another podcast in this growing media market that is following Ole Miss sports. That's a really good listen indeed. So Brad Logan's, working with David Johnson, talking about all that he's privy to all the inside information around Ole Miss fall camp. And my question is, Brad, after the first week of fall camp, what are the major things that are sticking out to you?
Offensive line looks really good. There's some depth pieces there. Obviously, there's an issue with Caleb Warren at center, but Reese McIntyre is actually doing some good things there at center. So it could eventually be a positive once they get Caleb Warren back. One name to watch is Quincy McGee, the transfer out of UAB. Looks good and is performing pretty well across that offensive line in I guess you could say, a backup capacity. So one thing I'm kind of looking at too is Cam East. People remember he's about 6'7", 380. He looks the part for sure. As people can remember, that was a big signee when Ole Miss was able to land Cam East. Right now, he's running behind Ayden Williams at right tackle. There's a bit of a battle with Victor Kearney. You'll remember Stephen, the transfer out of Washington. He's battling with Eli Acker at the left guard spot. So there's some battles going on. The good news is they're pretty deep. The two areas I think that Ole Miss are pretty solid in regards to depth is the defensive line and the offensive line. So both those lines look really good. Obviously, there's some question marks, I think, still at linebacker. Now, I mean, we've heard, and we've seen how well Suntory Perkins looks. I look back to that All-Star game when he was just making every tackle. Obviously, now things will be a whole lot different on the stage of the SEC, but he's getting a lot of accolades from his coaches, from Lane Kiffin, and from the national media as well. So, I mean, we could hit the high spots about, quarterback play with Jackson Dart, Spencer Sanders. That's been, talked about ad nauseum, and we know that Quinshon Judkins is there. I think I'm interested to see, someone asked me earlier what I thought about the running back room. And if you'll remember, the Kentucky game and the Alabama game, Ole Miss was driving late in the game against Alabama. Quinshon Judkins would just spin, and nobody could come in because you'll remember Zach Evans had been knocked out, and then Ulysses Bentley was hurt. Nobody was available. This year, they're 4 deep at running back, pending the waiver that they're asking for transfer Jam Griffin out of Oregon State. So if they get that transfer in, you've got Kedrick Riscano that's running a lot right now, along with a very healthy Ulysses Bentley. And then, of course, you've got Quinshon Judkins. So a 4 deep running back room. I know that Kevin Smith's very excited about that. But, yeah, I really like, what I've seen so far out of that offensive line play for sure.
Should be interesting. And full pads went on Thursday. This interview is going up, I think, on Friday night. So first full pad practice has happened. What do we make of Ayden Williams to this point?
The first time we had Lane Kiffin, after the first day of practice, he used the word special. And from the word that we're receiving is he's running second team right now. But you know as well as I do, they're going to run 8 to 10 receivers out every game. And so he's obviously going to play and going to play very early. He's just a talented specimen of a receiver. He's already been given the coveted number 1 to wear. We don't need to tell everybody watching and listening about who all's worn and use that number. So it's very high cotton. The question is Jordan Watkins dealing with a little bit of a hamstring issue, along with Zakiri Franklin, who had one of his knees has been scoped. So, the tentative date about getting Franklin back, you really need him as soon as possible. And then you really need Jordan Watkins to come back and be a stalwart at receiver. After that, you don't want to use the word pedestrian, but at that point you're looking at, Dayton Wade. I mean, Jalen Knox, who had an opportunity to make a move last year, didn't do a ton, but did a lot in the spring. Dayton Wade came on kind of in the latter part of the year. J.J. Henry's kind of just faded away a little bit, if you will. I think there's some opportunities for players like a Larry Simmons, for a Braylon Brown. The deal with all those players is there's been none that have taken that step forward. And Ole Miss really needs someone to take that step forward. And that could be Trey Harris, the senior transfer out of Louisiana Tech. I think by the end of the year, Trey Harris will be the leading receiver for Ole Miss. Now, I don't know what that means in terms of touchdowns, but I do think in regards to receiving yards, he's going to be the number one target. The good news, I think, is that tight end Caden Prescorn is going to be as good as Ole Miss has had in quite some time. And I'm going out on a limb. David wouldn't do that, but I'm going out on a limb, and I'm throwing in the name of Dawson Knox, more or less how he's progressed in his pro career, not necessarily what he's done or what he did at Ole Miss, because he was incredibly underutilized at Ole Miss. But then you start putting him in the words of Evan Ingram. I think the difference between Evan Ingram, Dawson Knox, and Caden Prescorn is going to be a bull of a blocker, which is good for that offensive front and Don Garrison. He's going to be able to use him a lot more as a blocking tight end because I'll be honest, I don't know that Michael Triggs is going to work out. There's been some issues already this year before we even played a game. So Prescorn's going to be a guy that's going to be able to step in along with, he's got some depth there with Tylen Heath, and we'll see where that tight end room goes. But I'm really excited about seeing what the tight ends can do as well.
Now, one thing that's interesting to me is, and I don't know if lucked into this situation, but this may be the way this falls, to where Ayden Williams could play himself into the starting two with Trey Harris, and then somebody like Zachary Franklin could move into that slot position. And you're looking at that, and if the lottery ticket that is Michael Trigg, if that light bulb comes on, he plays out in the slot some. That becomes a really matchup area that Lane Kiffin can play a lot of ways, right?
Well, you're hoping that someone like a Caden Lee can just come out of nowhere. Like I said, Dillon is another receiver that Ole Miss signed that hadn't done a ton, Jeremiah Dillon. So is there a receiver that's out there that can take a big step? We have been saying the name Braylon Brown for 2 years, and he hasn't, taken that extra step to be a significant player on this team. But if you can get a Franklin healthy, if you get a Jordan Watkins that is a proven receiver, if he can be 100%, I think things will be okay. But right now, there's a lot of unanswered questions at wide receiver. The question you do have answered is Ayden Williams, and I completely agree that midway through the year he could be a go-to receiver. There was a number of drops early on in practice, so I know that's something that the wide receiving core is something they just can't do. I mean, they're going to have to secure the football, and that's something that Ole Miss, specifically in the Egg Bowl, if you remember, there were two pivotal drops on third down. One coming across the middle with Jonathan Mingo, and then of course Malik Heath with a huge third down drop. So those are things you have to have, specifically at a wide receiving core that's so unproven like Ole Miss's.
Now that the pads are coming on, what do you think the major goal for Lane Kiffin and this Ole Miss team should be?
Defense, linebacker play. I mean, I get Suntarine Perkins. I know, we've talked about that, but he's, he looks more like a walk-up safety. And look, he's gonna put on the pounds, and he is a tough as a pine knot, and he's gonna make a ton of tackles. But I think more than anything is, you can't lose a Tysheem Johnson to Oregon, Davison Igbinosun to Ohio State, and not feel some form of an impact. And sure, they went to the portal and they got some players out of Liberty, out of Central Florida, and I get all that. So it's just a lot of unproven players in that secondary, and there's some unproven players at linebacker. I mean, we talked with Montgomery, and he likes the defense of Pete Golding, but Pete Golding doesn't have the players he had at Alabama. He's got the players that he inherited at Ole Miss, with the exception of a couple of players he's got to transfer in. I do think over the next couple of years that defense is going to have much more of a flavor for Pete Golding, but right now it's all about the horses, and I don't know that he's got the horses. I think we're going to see a lot of what we saw in the 2016, 2017 Ole Miss team, to where they were scoring a ton of points, but they were struggling some on defense. I think early on in the season, and you look at the season with opening with Mercer, and then that game at Tulane, and then coming home to Georgia Tech, those are 3 opportunities for Ole Miss to, for the lack of a better word, get right on defense. And what I mean by that is just to kind of feel themselves out. There's a ton of transfers. Even on the defense, got Stephon Wynn, Jared Ivey, J.J. Pegues, all those guys that transferred in, and just having a bit of an opportunity for them to mesh a little bit more together. And you can do that against Mercer and then Tulane. I don't get all the hype about how Ole Miss is going to struggle mightily down at Tulane and this environment with 38,000. Look, it's going to be 1,000 degrees. It's going to be at 2:30, and Ole Miss is just better than Tulane. They've got better athletes. And if Ole Miss can't go down and dominate Tulane, Ole Miss is going to have a long year, I'll be honest. So this is an opportunity for them to go down there, run for a lot of yards. Jackson Dart to find him a receiver that he can trust, which I think is going to be the Trey Harris coming out party, or Ayden Williams. It could be an opportunity for him to take a big step forward. Or maybe it's one of the unknowns we talked about earlier. But I do think that it is good for Ole Miss that they open with 3 teams that they should beat before they head off to Tuscaloosa and kind of find themselves in a bit of the hornet's nest and have an opportunity to get their feet under them before they go into the SEC.
So have you heard when Zachary Franklin might be back, might return to action?
There's some reports that he could, the preliminary, thoughts are he could be back by Alabama. That would give him a couple of weeks of practice and then a practice full game week of full speed. That would be kind of an educated guess, would be Alabama's what some reports have said. At the end of the day, they don't think it's anything severe, but I don't think there's any doubt. The wide receiver position is one in which Ole Miss needs an immediate jolt of energy, and that would be Franklin for sure.
Okay. And we talked about all the transfers and everything. You sit down and you see how the amount of FBS football those guys have played, though?
It's a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a concern. And I don't think that anyone that follows Ole Miss or follows college football can once again, I go back to the fact that when you lose players to Ohio State, Utah, and Oregon, and you get players from Liberty, from Central Florida, Georgia Tech, or South Florida, wherever it was, that's obviously a cause of concern. But then I always come back to Lane Kiffin, Pete Golding. You have to trust their evaluation. And if they think a player from Jones College is better than a transfer from USC, then you trust their evaluation. And that's exactly what I tell fans. There's been a lot of hand-wringing over the 24 class. Ole Miss only just a few 4-star products on the 24/7 database, mostly 3 stars. I tell the people that wring their hands over the star rankings is you have to trust the evaluation of the coaching staff. I mean, there's a reason they have Alfred Beavers out of Jones Community College or Jones College down in South Mississippi. They like him a lot. And that's what Ole Miss fans just must do is trust the evaluation of the coaches.
Yeah, we're situation. I try to explain all the time on my podcast, and I don't know if it gets known. We have a coaching staff at Ole Miss that recruits to the 85 and not to the 25. And the 25 is the former recruiting limit that they were able to sign. So you would always look at in recruiting a single class, and all wars would happen on that class, and it would all be about a player, whether or not they chose your school. But the fact of the matter is, right now, he is trying to develop a totality of a roster. And if you look at the micro parts of this recruiting class, I think this defensive line class that Ole Miss has recruited is probably one of the best ones that Ole Miss has gotten since maybe Orgeron was here with Tillman and Peregieri and those guys. Mm-hmm. And so there are some highlights in this class.
Yes, and I think that, in regards to the defensive line, I think they have more depth than they've had since the middle 90s. I mean, I think the depth and the way they've been able to pad that defensive front is, Ole Miss has been a program that's synonymous for, having good wide receivers, having good quarterback play, good running backs, but never really having a defensive line or linebackers. Now, the linebacking core, we'll see. This could be a situation where, things kind of came together a couple of years ago when Mark Robinson was ended up being a phenomenal linebacker for Ole Miss, but he came in as a walk-on running back. There may be some there may be some stars, some diamonds in the rough. We'll have to wait and see. But right now, you're just kind of hoping that Monty Montgomery, along with John Jean Baptiste, Ashante Sistrunk, can take a pretty good step forward on this defense and be a leader. But the defensive front loaded, and I think a lot of people are excited about that. The good news too, Stephen, is I think from a linebacker perspective and even from a defensive back perspective as well, if you have a really good defensive line, that's going to do nothing but help the linebackers and the cornerbacks do better at their positions because it's tying up more blockers. And that's given those opportunities to those secondary players, along with those linebackers as well, to make some plays on defense.
I think I saw this from Chuck Rounsville or something like that. Ladarius Tennyson moving from safety to
Mm-hmm.
linebacker. What are your thoughts on that?
That means that they need help at linebacker. And yeah, if Chuck's saying it, I can guarantee you it's probably true. Tennyson, that transfer of Auburn, really good secondary player, or it could mean that they've had someone younger that's stepping up across that secondary as well. But honestly, I think it's probably because Ole Miss is thin at linebacker. And the good news, I don't know that they're going to be using as many linebackers as they did last year. So you may see more 2 linebacker sets. And the more of the NFL packages, you see a lot of those 2 linebacker sets. So I think that's just going to be a depth piece as well. And that was just a decision to pad that depth a little bit at linebacker.
All right. Thanks for making the Locked On Ole Miss podcast your first listen every day. We're free and available wherever you get your podcast, including YouTube. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Again, thank you for making the Locked On Ole Miss podcast your Ole Miss morning show. Thank you to Brad Logan from Inside the Rebels and the Red and Blue Crew podcast for joining us on the show today, man. Thank you very much.